interspersing it with sermon series from the New Testament. In Genesis, the Israelites ended up in Egypt because of Joseph. We started Exodus, I don't know if anyone can remember, it was last July, and things had turned sour for the Israelites, so God uses Moses and his brother Aaron to rescue them. Last week, Exodus 32 was not a high point. The people disobeyed God by worshipping the golden calf. The people spend 40 years in the wilderness, and Moses and Aaron die and are buried there. I used to assume that the reason the people were so long in the desert was either because it was very big or they weren't very good at navigating. This was because I didn't know my Bible well enough. In fact, the Israelites reached the promised land after only 18 months. But then they became frightened. Chapter 13 of the book of Numbers tells of the 12 spies they sent into the land, 10 of whom came back with reports about giants. 2 of the spies said, "We can and we should take the land, because that's what God expects of us, and he will be with us." The 2 spies to whom the people did not listen were Joshua and Caleb. As a result, entry into the land was delayed, indeed forbidden, for most of the people, but Joshua and Caleb and those born after leaving Egypt were eventually let in. And so we come to the book named after Joshua. Joshua has been given the mantle of leadership by God and is the one who is to lead the people into the land. Please turn to our passage, Joshua chapter 1 on page 207 of the Church Bibles. The first point I want to make is this: God keeps his promises. Verse 3, "I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses." Verse 6, "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them." In fact, the promise regarding the land goes back to the covenant God made with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. Well, as I've already mentioned, yesterday I went to Missions Fest, at which Will Graham spoke. I like him because he speaks sincerely and straightforwardly, and he makes basic points clearly. He was asked a question about a person's assurance of salvation. The basic but vital point that Will Graham made in his reply is that it is God who saves, as he put it. If we save ourselves, then yes, that would be in doubt. But if God has decided something, he's not going to go back on that. I've mentioned before how Christianity is a supernatural religion. Indeed, I've mentioned how I was commended for saying this when I preached in Bermuda. The problem is, I think we know the theory about God, But somehow there can be a disconnect when it comes to the practical nitty-gritty. As someone reportedly said to my predecessor, where I was rector before, what's God got to do with it? Friends, let this account of biblical history from the book of Exodus and now Joshua be a lesson to us. God is concerned with the nitty-gritty of life. It's his modus operandi. He brings who he is, a God of faithfulness without injustice, good and upright is he. His work is perfect and all his ways are just. He brings that and combines it with a mentality that gets down, gets involved, and gets the job done. Nothing is impossible for God. God has promised land. Well, you can't get more down to earth than that. And he delivers. And he does so by using people, specifically leaders. There were Moses and Aaron, and now there's Joshua. The prayer book and the authorized version of the Bible are thought of as quaintly poetic, with their use of thee, thou, and thine. But have you noticed that they both also use you and your? What's up? The fact is, thee, thou, and thine are used and are useful as designating the singular form, as opposed to the plural, you and your. And this distinction is present in Hebrew, in which the book of Joshua was originally written, as well as in Greek, the New Testament's language. I mention this because there's a difference between verses 3 and 4 and verses 5 to 9 that the NIV isn't able to convey to us. In verses 3 and 4 of our passage, the you and your are plural. God is talking about all the people. But in verses 5 to 9, in every instance, you and your are in fact singular. God is referring specifically to Joshua. Insert Joshua's name throughout those verses, and we see how strategically important Joshua was as a leader, fulfilling God's purposes. Who was Joshua? Moses had been a prophet. Aaron had been a priest. Joshua, he was a military leader, a general, if you wish, and he became a statesman. God uses whoever is best able to bring about his purposes in any given situation. Not just priests or prophets, but soldiers and political leaders. God is thoroughly practical and down to earth about this. It can be frustrating to see people's attitude toward Christianity. It's regarded as somehow a personal and therefore private thing. Somewhat effete. Something that some people have as a comfort, but not really connected to life in general. It's seen as being a bit like garlic bread. You know, you're at a restaurant. Garlic bread, something that people might like to have on the side, an optional extra, but not intrinsic to the meal. How different this is from the God of Joshua. A God who uses a general, who leads a nation in conquest of land. Thanks to God, whose word was spoken in the deed that made the earth. His the voice that called a nation. His the fires that tried her worth. You might, of course, want to make the obvious point, but Joshua is in the Old Testament. Isn't there a danger with all this talk of God and land that we get into the realm of current-day geopolitics and the question of modern Israel? Indeed, there were some protesters outside Missions Fest who seemed to want to make a point about this. I do not share the view of some, it has to be said primarily American evangelicals, regarding the restoration of Israel as part of God's present-day purposes. For me, the new Israel, which is the Christian church, has superseded the old Israel. We look forward to the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. Revelation 21:2. But, having said that, there is a connection between the New Jerusalem and the Old, just as there is a connection between the new earth and what preceded it. And indeed, between our current bodies and what will be our resurrection bodies. The whole of biblical history shows a concern by God for the world. After all, he created it. John tells us, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, John 3:16. Mark records these words of Jesus, go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation. Mark 16:15. God doesn't abandon the world. He redeems it. In physical terms, the new Israel, in fact, occupies the whole earth. In today's gospel reading from Matthew chapter 1, which you'll find on page 933 of the church Bibles, the angel says to Joseph, in verse 21, about Mary, she will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Joseph would have understood the connection between the name Jesus and the reason the angel gives for using it, because he will save his people from their sins. We, however, may need a bit of extra help, which even the most basic NIV provides. Have a look at the footnote. I'm not sure what letter it will be in your Bible. It's letter A in the one I've got in front of me. It was letter C in the study Bible I had at home. Jesus is the Greek form of Joshua, which means the Lord saves. Call him Jesus, because he will save his people. Alongside the Christian church being the new Israel and the promised land now being the whole earth, we now have a new God-appointed leader, one chosen with the attributes required for the task in hand. The book of Joshua ends with Joshua's death and burial. But generations later, he was superseded by another Joshua, Jesus, whom the grave could not hold. Highest heaven its Lord receives, yet he loves the earth he leaves. Though returning to his throne, still he calls mankind his own. Amen.